Well, Vladimir knew something vaguely about Christianity because his mother and his aunt had had some connection with Christianity. But you understand that Vladimir, like almost all of the East Slavs who lived in the territory in those days, by the way, you notice I'm not using the word Russian here, but rather East Slav. They spoke a common Slavic language spoken by all Slavic people in those days. Russian, Ukrainian, and White Russian, which are East Slavic languages, came somewhat later. They had a pre-Christian religion. Notice, by the way, I don't call it pagan. I don't like the word pagan because it implies a certain kind of condescension to that which came before, and I think it's a mistake to condescend to any religion that people believe in sincerely. And after all, who are we to say that our religion is somehow better or more advanced than their religion? Almost every genuine religion of humankind deals with the eternal human questions in ways that seem logical and reasonable to the people who follow it. So, of course, Vladimir's people had this pre-Christian religion. So he said to the Byzantine emperor, well, what is this? The Byzantine emperor said, don't worry, I'm going to give you some documents that will explain it to you. Mind you, he wasn't talking to Vladimir, he was talking to his emissaries. And now we have to go back in history, roughly a century, to the slightly beyond the middle of the 800s AD, to the year 863. The Byzantine emperor had taken it into his mind that he wanted to conquer the territory in what in those days was called Moravia. Today we would call it Czechia or Slovakia. He wanted to send his troops there. Now, the Eastern Orthodox religion did not insist the way the Roman Catholics did. They did not insist on their language. The Roman Catholics, for many, many centuries, the holy language was Latin. All religious things had to be done in Latin. For the Byzantines, of course, their language was Greek, and what was written for them was in Greek, but they said, look, there's a historical accident. When we go to other people's, we'll translate it, and they'll do it in their language. So, of course, what he needed was somebody who could turn the holy documents into Slavic. He went to the University of Constantinople, where he found two scholars named Cyril and Methodius. They're Christian names, very talented people, very fluent in Slavic. He said, I want you to translate these materials, these necessary religious materials, the Mass, the lives of the saints, parts of the New Testament, parts of the Old Testament, into a language they will understand, into Slavic. Well, as I said, that's all well and good. We'd like to do that, but there's a slight problem. There's no alphabet, and things have never been written before in Slavic. He said, well, go ahead, make an alphabet. And so they did. They made an alphabet that later on was somewhat modified, somewhat changed, about 100 years later, and in honor of Cyril, it was called the Cyrillic alphabet. It's quite a remarkable alphabet, phonetically speaking, because 1,000 years later, it still deals quite directly and quite simply with the phonetic then sound system of the languages it described. There are no horrors in it as the way there are in English. For example, in English, the word night, N-I-G-H-T, througugh, T-H-R-O-U-G-H. There are no such orthographical monstrosities in the Slavic languages. The way it's written is the way it's pronounced. Now, mind you, there are a few small exceptions to this, but by and large, it was a brilliant job of making an alphabet. But not only was it a brilliant job of making an alphabet, Cyril and Methodius had enormous literary talent, and the translations they came through with were at a very high level of literary power and taste. These were remarkable translations. You know, of course, that in English we do have quite a powerful translation in the King James edition of the Bible, because, of course, King James came shortly after the time of Shakespeare, when the English language, believe me, was alive and kicking in a very powerful way, as you know, if you know something about Shakespeare. But even the King James edition, as high a level as I think it reaches, does not reach the level either of sophistication or of power which Cyril and Methodius managed to get into the biblical text. The Psalms, which of course, as you probably know, were originally written in Hebrew, are extraordinarily powerful poetry, perhaps some of the most powerful poetry that at least our civilization has ever produced. And the Psalms, as they're done in Slavic, in Cyril's translation, are remarkably moving and remarkably powerful. I think they even go beyond what we have in the King James Version, although I think very highly of the King James Version. In short, Eastern Slavic and eventually Russian literature got started at the very beginning at an extraordinarily high level of power, of sophistication, of the sound of the language, the use of the language. They got a truly remarkable start. Consequently, Vladimir was converted. His wife came back to him to Kiev. And so, when he came back, he said to the people around, all right, you're Christians. They said, Christians? What's that? He said, look, I've got some documents here, and that's going to show you what they are, but this will show you. And he pulled out of his scabbard the sword. He raised the sword over. He said, this will show you. They said, you're right, boss. You're absolutely right. We're Christians. Again, they may not have used quite the language I'm using here, but that was the upshot. They realized that, like it or not, they had to convert to the Christian religion. I should have mentioned, by the way, that the actual conversion of the Slavs is thought to be the year 988 or 989. Some of you may know, just not too many years ago, in 1988, even in the Soviet Union, they celebrated a millennium of Christianity in Russia. And of course, this meant a great deal to the Russian imagination and to Russian religion. Well, of course, that was all well and good for the court, but what about the peasantry? Of course, the overwhelming majority of the population of that time. What about the people who worked the fields? What about the people who made up the whole population? They, after all, had an old religion, an old pre-Christian religion. It had the god of the wind, it had the god of the sun, it had the god of the river. When things happened in nature, they connected almost immediately with the gods whom they worshipped. In some ways, it's not entirely different from what the ancient Greeks had, that we know, of course, the Greek and Roman mythology. As the Greeks worshipped Zeus, as they worshipped Apollo, as they worshipped Venus, I'm using now I should say Aphrodite, to keep it Greek. As they worshipped these gods, as they identified these gods in the various parts of their lives, so the pre-Christian Slavs identified gods like Dashbog, Stribog, people like that, with the natural part of their agriculture, the wind that was so important for their crops, the sun that was so important for their crops, the rain that was so important, the river to which they ran when water was necessary. All of these things came together in that pre-Christian religion, which was beautifully connected with nature, which was beautifully connected with the seasons of the year, that stood for everything that was deeply important to their lives. And now all of a sudden they were told, you're going to be Christians. They said, Christians? What's that? And again, this time the nobles took the sword out of the scabbard and said, this will show you what it is. And of course they realized that if they valued the distance between their head and their neck, they had better say they were Christians, and so they did. But of course, it's one thing to say that you're Christians. It's one thing to give lip service to an ideology that people are trying to force upon you. If someone says, look, you say what I want you to say or I'll shoot you. Well, they did have guns in those days, although primitive ones, to be sure. As a matter of fact, I think the guns came later. They had bows and arrows, they had swords. If somebody says, look, there's a sword over your head, and unless you say what I want you to say, your head's about to come off, most likely, there might be a few courageous persons around, a Solzhenitsyn or two, but by and large, you're going to say, okay, I'll say what you want me to say. But it's one thing for them to say it. It's quite another thing what goes on inside of themselves. When the wind blows, they're not going to pray to the Christian God, they're going to pray to the God of the wind. When the sun gets in their eyes, they're not going to pray to the Christian God, but pray to the God of the sun. And so this goes on in many different ways. What you got was a system which in Russian is called dvoyeverие. That is to say, two faiths set together at the same time. And these two faiths went in parallel, of course, gradually beginning to come together through many centuries of Russian history. As a matter of fact, if you roll forward very far to the 20th century, it turned not into dvoyeverие, but troyeverие, because the Marxists were determined to impose their ideology and something they would call their religion on the people. So not only did they have the pre-Christian and the Christian ideas, but also the ideas of Marxism, which they had to take as set in stone. This is something that the Russian people have had a great deal of experience in living through. That is, people telling them, now this is the way you have to think, this is the way you have to feel, this is the way you have to believe, and this is the way you have to act. This combination of religions, of course, made all sorts of psychic problems, and of course no small amount of psychological pains for the Russians, but there's another side to it. It also meant that there was a very, very rich culture with many, many different aspects to it. There was, of course, that marvelous pre-Christian Russian culture, which of course they didn't lose, no matter how much they said they were Christians. On the other hand, there was also this very, very powerful doctrine of Christianity, which after all came not only into the Slavic territory, but it spread through the world among tens of millions of people. It was not any accident that this took hold of people's imagination. The body and the teachings of Christ, the magnificent stories of the New Testament, the very powerful and all-encompassing stories of the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament who is all-powerful and who when I'm tempted to say his thunderbolts, but of course that was Zeus in Greece. Nevertheless, when the God of the Old Testament wanted to work his will, he worked it very well, and of course there were people who were in very close communication with him. Just, of course, as Jesus Christ, being the Son of God, naturally had a considerably close communication with his own Father, who was God. You put these things together with those pre-Christian teachings, and what you have is an explosively powerful culture which went on through the centuries. What's interesting is that in comparatively modern Russian literature, you have many, many examples of the old pre-Christian faith. Just one or two of them, just to give you some idea. The idea of bird down, of puch, as it's called in Russian. When Russians go to visit the graves of people whom they loved but who are now lying in the cemetery, they go with handfuls or perhaps containerfuls of bird down, very, very light, very, very fluffy kind of stuff, which they take out and sprinkle slowly and ceremoniously over the graves, because it is said, bird down quickens the eyes of the dead. And what they want to do is to accelerate that resurrection that they're hoping for in the people who were there before. That combination of the Christian idea of resurrection, of life that will somehow go on beyond this life, plus the nature that's contained in the bird down, is of course something that makes not only for very powerful poetry, but for a very powerful feeling of life. It's no accident that Russian literature through many centuries has been connected with politics. The Marxists, of course, insisted that the revolutionary Marxists insisted that literature be devoted exclusively to the kind of ideology, the kind of revolutionary ideology that they wanted. They wouldn't admit the existence of any other kind of literature in their time. But believe me, this idea did not start with Trotsky and the Bolsheviks. It started many, many centuries before in the situation that Vladimir found himself, where he was trying to defend Kiev by an alliance with Byzantium and, of course, with the Christianity that Byzantium brought. So that tight combination of ideology and politics on the one hand, and literature and ideas of the spirit and of the imagination on the other, was something that went way, way back in Russian literature. There's, of course, a tremendous struggle for faith as the leitmotif of literature. How could one believe? How is it possible to believe in a God that stood for good, for virtue, for all those things which we admire in life, when life is so chock full of the evil that we see all around us? If you look into the soul and to the psychological makeup of the human being, you of course find things that are connected with the Madonna, with the highest thing of Christianity, but you also find some very ugly spots. Of course, spots that we often try to hide from ourselves. But when we look at these spots directly and with full vision, what do we see? How do we make some kind of a connection between the nasty parts of ourselves, that Dostoevsky, by the way, understood very well, and those heavenly aspirations, which, by the way, Dostoevsky equally well understood? How do we make that connection? That goes way back into the history that I'm talking for now and becomes a kind of a leitmotif throughout all of Russian literature. Does God exist? Well, yes, he does exist, or she does exist. Does God exist? Well, maybe God doesn't exist. Maybe atheism is the better argument. And the dialectic, the argument takes place in a way that really tortures, but at the same time examines human souls. The pre-Christian gods also play their part because of the tremendous appreciation of the beauties of nature. Nature becomes almost as powerful in Russian literature as it is in the biblical universe, where the universe was alive and sounding with the sounds of nature, with the events of nature, with the eclipses of nature, with the power of the rivers, with the power of the wind, with the sun in your eyes. All of these things came together in this magnificent combination, which was the ideology, which was the push, which was the spiritual insight that underlay the history of Russian literature. And that's, of course, what we're going to be talking about not only in the next lecture, but I hope through all the lectures to come.